Bringing TPLF to justice is a prerequisite for peace and stability in the Horn of Africa. Ethiopian American Council calls for solidarity with the people of Ethiopia to bring peace and stability to the region by bringing the terrorist group TPLF to justice. EAC is alarmed by misinformation that is spreading on the current tragic events in Ethiopia. The media faults Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed for bombing Tigray and refusing to negotiate with the TPLF, Tigray People Liberation Front, a group registered in the Global Terrorism Database. The lack of understanding of the build-up to this conflict is dangerous, and the international push for mediation with TPLF will lead to destabilization of the entire Horn of Africa and create a breeding ground for global terrorism. EAC calls for solidarity with the Ethiopian people and all the people of the Horn of Africa. The Ethiopian American Council of North America, EAC, an advocate for political change in Ethiopia and the protection of human rights for Ethiopian Americans and other members of the Ethiopian diaspora, respectfully calls on the international community to stand by the 100 million plus people of Ethiopia and support efforts to bring the criminal junta, TPLF, to justice and stabilize a region of over 130 million people. TPLF has shown itself to be the epitome of brutality and corruption when it is in power, and a merchant of terror and chaos when it is not in power. Clearly, it is a no-win situation as long as TPLF exists, and bringing them to justice is a prerequisite to stabilizing a region of over 130 million people. Why it's critical to get it right when it comes to Ethiopia. According to a November 19, 2020 briefing by Tibor Nagy, U.S. Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of African Affairs, Ethiopia, most especially since Prime Minister Abiy has taken power, is the linchpin in the region, of course, with over 100 million people and a 2,000-year-old history as a state. The only country in sub-Saharan Africa that was never colonized. It is a key strategic partner for the United States. He also adds, the United States very much wants Ethiopia to be able to continue playing a positive role in the region, exporting stability and hopefully at some point in the not too distant future, prosperity as well. Ambassador Rayner confirms Ethiopia is basically a net exporter of security to the broader region. TPLF, on the other hand, is an ethnic-based terrorist group who seeks the advancement, as clearly stated in its name, of Tigrayans, who represent 6% of the population of a nation with over 80 ethnicities. The only way such a small minority could consolidate power is clearly through a divide and rule strategy. TPLF redrew the map of Ethiopia along ethnic lines and forced all citizens to identify themselves on their ID by their ethnicity for the first time in their history. They particularly targeted the Amhara ethnicity and fabricated false narratives that portray the Amhara in particular, about 30% of the population, as being historic enemies of other ethnicities, especially the Oromo. This led to hundreds of gruesome killings of Amhara civilians for over 15 years. In addition, hundreds of Anuak were murdered and thousands displaced so that fertile land could be given to foreign investors. Having thus divided the country as documented by foreign policy, TPLF dominated not just the military but the economy as well, and hundreds, if not thousands, of TPLF leaders and loyalists miraculously became multimillionaires and in some cases billionaires, while the poor country reeled from massive debt. This level of injustice against 94% of the population of the second most populous country in Africa can only lead to mass upheaval. TPLF will turn Ethiopia into a net exporter of instability, which is fertile ground for other terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab. TPLF has shown itself to be capable of unspeakable atrocities against innocent civilians. This includes the gruesome ISIS-style killings of over 500 civilians on November the 12th, 2020, as reported by Amnesty International and Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. From this report, it is clear that the civilians were targeted for being ethnic Amharas, about 30% of the population. These civilians were migrant workers and were targeted specifically for their Amhara ethnicity. In addition, per Assistant Secretary Nagy, the TPLF leadership has admitted responsibility for the November 13th missile launches at airports in Bahir Dar and Gondar in the Amhara region and the November 14th attack in Eritrea. These unacceptable attacks make the situation more dangerous, and the Secretary condemned them in the most recent statement. The Western media reports that it is unclear who the perpetrators of this genocide were. Both the Amnesty EHRC reports are clear it was committed by retreating TPLF soldiers, and in Mr. Nagy's briefing, he also states, "We remain deeply concerned over reports that civilians have been purposely targeted and attacked. We condemn the November 12th massacre in Maikadra, apparently perpetrated by TPLF soldiers and militia as they retreated from the town." The lead-up to the law enforcement operation on Tigray. Ethiopia, as one of the poorest countries, was already stretched to the limit fighting COVID, locust invasion of historic proportion, waves of ethnic-based massacres of Amharas, Guragis, Gamo, and massive internal displacement of people, diplomatic battles with Egypt on the Gerd Dam, and so on. It would be ludicrous for the government to stretch itself further by starting a conflict in Tigray. Clearly, it was forced to respond to endless attacks by TPLF. TPLF lost power in Ethiopia in April 2018, following mass upheavals by Oromo and Amhara youth who were fed up of 27 years of oppression by a small minority. TPLF officials retreated to Tigray to orchestrate a return to the seat of power. Since 2018, Abiy had been taking a very conciliatory approach to the TPLF, and though he arrested some of the most corrupt TPLF members, including generals, the vast majority of them and their huge business interest remained untouched, presumably so as not to cause destabilization in the country. Prime Minister Abiy continued to preach his message of inclusiveness per his philosophy of Medemere. Dismissing this message of peace, starting in 2019, TPLF officials from their hideout in Tigray used their vast stolen wealth to train and sponsor terror squads, mostly Oromo extremists known as OLF Shene. A Defense and Foreign Affairs special analysis confirms that TPLF was funding these acts of genocidal terrorism. They were able to target Amhara citizens living in all areas of the country, as ethnicity is indicated on their ID as mandated by TPLF law. There were hundreds of people, including women and children, who were savagely killed in ISIS-style executions, hangings, beheadings, butchering by machetes, and so on. Though only some of these massacres were reported in the media, including by Bloomberg and The Guardian, there were multiple waves of these killings, spreading terror among civilians. Oromo extremists also targeted the Gamo, Gurage, and other ethnicities, and even Oromos if they were Orthodox Christians. Scores of people were killed and hundreds of thousands displaced. For the last 3 months, all Ethiopians have been horrified to hear daily reports of savage ethnic-based killings and fearing we were heading the way of Rwanda. From April 2018 to September 2020, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, as well as civilian goodwill groups such as Mothers for Peace, as well as a group of elders, made a total of over 14 attempts to bring TPLF into the fold. It was clear that Prime Minister Abiy's message of inclusiveness and love was lost on the brutes of TPLF and OLF Shene. The massacres continued. Traumatized by the unending waves of terror and barbaric reports of hundreds of civilians being butchered by OLF Shene with the training and financial backing of TPLF, Ethiopians demanded the Prime Minister stop his preaching and start taking action to bring about rule of law. The Prime Minister refused to take military action to avoid the horrors and civilian cost it would entail. In September 2020, the Prime Minister changed the currency of Ethiopia to, among other things, render null and void the sacks of cash TPLF had stashed all over the country to fund their terror operation of having OLF Shene target and massacre villains of specific ethnicities, mostly Amharas, but also included Guragas and others. Emboldened by the lack of military action, TPLF attacked the northern command post of the Ethiopian National Defense Force, ENDF, stationed in Tigray on November 3rd, 2020, killing hundreds of unsuspecting soldiers of the ENDF, a move condemned by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. These soldiers had just helped the local civilians in Tigray fight a locust invasion of historic proportions, and their reward was to be brutally murdered as they slept, betrayed by their own Tigrayan general, who coordinated the attack with TPLF forces. With this attack, TPLF crossed the final red line and prompted the bombings by the Ethiopian military. To Ethiopians, the question was why it took so long to bring the criminals to justice. Since the start of the law enforcement operation, while the Ethiopian forces are doing everything to avoid civilian casualties, TPLF has clearly been targeted civilians, as well as trying to internationalize the conflict. The horrifying Maikadra massacre of over 500 civilians is case in point, as reported by Amnesty International and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission.